Hi there, and welcome to episode 8 of the J&J podcast. Today we're here with Giovanni from the Northeastern College Democrats. So Jack and I are going to be talking with him about a number of topics, including Supreme Court, cancel culture, progressives, housing, crime, pretty much everything. So do you want to tell us who you are, a little bit about your club, what you do there?
Yeah, totally. So my name is Giovanni Falco. As I was just mentioned, I'm the current Director of Communications for the Northeastern College Democrats. So I'd work with the Dems and the school and the wider Boston community to talk about initiatives on campus, to talk about Democratic politicians and topics and issues, and help build this larger coalition of Democrats, both within our Northeastern community and in the greater Boston area.
Yeah. So I just kind of, how do you politically identify yourself? Because I know some people are they're a Republican, but then they're more libertarian or big government, and then Democrats maybe more progressive. So how would you kind of identify yourself?
Yeah, so I'm from Vermont. I've in Vermont, fun fact, you actually don't register with a party. So technically I'm not registered to any party, but I have been a Democrat for my entire life. I'm definitely, more of the left of center rather than moderate Democrat. So big Bernie Sanders guy, but I'm also a big Joe Biden guy. So somewhere in between there.
Go, base Joe Biden. I'm kind of curious as to, so you mentioned you're also doing more with the community, and you also are obviously very active in this club. Why, and then also how are you so active in all of these things? Because we're doing this podcast because we're kind of just playing around and it's interesting and we're kind of nerdy. But it seems like you're doing more. So where does this kind of passion come from?
Yeah, so I really want to pursue a job and career in federal politics, in federal government in general. And I think this stems from the work I've done back home in Vermont. I've worked for 2 U.S. congressional campaigns. Just most recently, Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray ran for Congress. And even after that, I was on the Maura Healey campaign here in Massachusetts. So, really trying to spread that Democratic message, really trying to build this larger coalition of Democrats that are, in this community that I'm a part of.
Yeah, nice. So kind of you're in campus talking about your political opinions all the time. I'm sure you take a lot of poli-sci classes. So we had a great conversation with Ronan from the Northeastern University College Republicans, and he was mentioning how he kind of feels sometimes frustrated with a more liberal environment where he feels like he can't really express his opinions that much. And I know you're a Democrat, so I was wondering if you ever feel and you said you're left of center, so I was wondering if you ever feel uncomfortable sharing your opinions in the classroom, and whether you think it's positive, neutral, negative, that people feel like the classroom is kind of liberal.
Yeah, so I think for me personally, I don't feel uncomfortable in class speaking out. I mean, even if I was in a place like Texas, I think I'd still, more than happily give them my political views. Yeah. But you're at a large university with a diverse amount of people, and I do think that there's sometimes echo chambers within the classrooms. However, I do believe that professors provide ample opportunity for people of different political beliefs to give their opinion. I actually have class with Ronan and in my U.S. Congress class, so I know that there's, all of us have a good time talking about different political issues in our perspectives. So,
and then more in the context of your club, if you were to speak for them, what's the goal apart from, is it just to kind of spread the message? Is it to get people more, go out and vote into politics? What would you say the goal is in general?
Yeah, so I think as an organization, we have 3 main goals. The first one is to just increase, campus engagement with politics in general. Whether you're a Democrat or a moderate or you don't know what you are yet, we want you to come to our club to see what we're about and see how you can get involved on campus. The second thing, I think, is to, build this larger coalition of Democrats and talk about policies and get involved in the community. We're all temporary residents here, but there's so many ways for us to get involved and make a difference here in Boston. Yeah. So that's the second thing. And I think the last thing is to, young voters need to turn out to vote. And I think that's something we spend a lot of time on, with NU Votes and other organizations on campus, is to make sure that, college kids are either here in Boston or back home going out to vote, because we are the future leaders of this country, so we need us to go out there and vote. And this past election, we saw that 27% of the voting population were young voters, which is, higher, not as high as 2018, but high for a midterm election. So, I think that's part of the reason why Democrats, stopped this red wave is because we got out there and voted.
Yeah, young people definitely voted. How do you think you should navigate pushing that? How can we get young people to go out and vote more, do you think?
I think it's by getting them involved in these organizations, to show them there's opportunities to get involved, to have positions, to build a resume, to, care about different topics that, affect everything that, you believe in and you're a part of.
Yeah. And one organization that's really popular with the young people is the YDSA, the Democratic Socialist, and Northeastern has one on campus. They're pretty big. So I was kind of wondering, what your thoughts are on them, and then more broadly, what are your kind of thoughts on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party? I know you said that you like Bernie Sanders, so I was kind of curious your thoughts on first the NEU, YDSA, and then also just progressives as a whole.
Yeah, so YDSA is a great partner of ours. We work together on different projects in coalitions on campus. And again, I think that's one of our big goals as an organization is to, build this larger Democratic coalition. We want to get as many students involved. We want as many students, participating in our discussions. And I think that partnering with YDSA is the best way to do that. They also have a large, member status, so it's great to have their perspective come in and into our conversations as well. I think, in the Democratic Party on the national level, we see how, diverse the Democratic Party is becoming. And I think that's what we need more of. We need more actual policy discussions rather than, debates about who won the last election. Yeah. And I think that's what YDCA provides for us is actual policy debates. Now, we might not always agree on things. They also, have tended to be burn the institution down, where we're not as, radical as that. But a lot of us agree on many topics that, we talk about.
And for those listening, I wanted to set a little bit of context, and maybe you can help with this. I think maybe a year or two ago, Northeastern was the #1 rated most liberal school in the country. I don't know if it's still #1, but it's very high up there. So it makes sense that the YDSA has a big following, at least from their Instagram followers. I think they have, what's the number? 20,000 followers or something like that, right? So they're big here. So I don't know. We can move into talking about progressives as well, how you feel about progressives more nationally or at least in Congress. I know you're a Bernie fan, so.
Yeah, totally. So, again, I don't agree with everything Bernie Sanders says and does, but I know that from a Vermonter perspective, he's done a lot for the people of Vermont when he was mayor and now when he became part of our federal delegation. But I think we see this polarization in our party, in the Democratic Party. I know on a national level we talk about polarization between the Democrats and Republicans and how it's bad for democracy. But if you look at the polarization between, progressives and the squad in the House, so the AOCs, and then, of course, the moderates like Chuck Schumer's and others, they disagree on many different topics. But that's what democracy is about. And I think that with that dialogue, with that discussion, it pushes positive legislation forward that we are not seeing in the Republican Party.
Yeah, I think I actually attended a Democrat club meeting last year. I don't remember if it was you or somebody else, but there was a big debate about whether there should be a multi-party system or we should just have Democrats and Republicans. And I know, as you said, a lot of YDSA people might say burn the institution down. We need a bunch of parties, or we maybe don't even want parties. I don't know. But I was kind of wondering, do you like the current system of Democrats and Republicans? You said that there's a lot of diversity within them, or would you kind of prefer a bigger kind of more broad spectrum of parties?
Gosh, such an easy question. Thanks. So, I think that there's a lot of benefits to having a two-party system in the United States. Yeah. With that being said, I think recently, especially after the Trump years, there's been this divide between the two parties where, even a fist bump, Liz Cheney fist bumping Joe Biden at a State of the Union address is causing issues, and that's not what we need in this country. It's also not helpful for, passing productive legislation. It's not, beneficial to working across the aisle and getting things done and making sure Americans are the ones we're caring about, not our political goals. And I think that's something that we need to work on as a nation. Hyperpolarization in this country is a huge problem. But I don't think it stems from the bottom, from the voters. I think it stems from our members of Congress who are, using the public as a weapon to build this new coalition of radical ideas, especially within the Republican Party. Donald Trump has weaponized tactics and policy issues to create this radical MAGA, sector of the Republican Party, and it's causing more division within the nation than we need.
I'm curious when you talked about Trump right now. From my perspective, it seems like the Democratic Party, even though sometimes progressives don't vote for some things that maybe the moderate Democrats might want to vote for, they're way more united than at least today's Republican Party. Where do you see this going with Trump and DeSantis and everything that's happened in the last 3 weeks, which seems like forever ago?
Yeah, so, I mean, if we use the midterm election, which was historic, right? It defied historical trends. Pundits were completely incorrect about this supposed red wave that was supposed to happen. If we use that as a model for, the Trump 2024 run after his announcement, I think that it'll be interesting for one to see who runs. I think that's going to be a huge, factor in how he does with the Republican Party, because Ron DeSantis is a big player within the party as well. However, they both draw from that. They also draw from the same base. A lot of Trump voters are also pro DeSantis, so it's going to be interesting how they split. Will they go with DeSantis or will they go with Trump? But if we use the midterms as a gauge, I think, and this is my prediction, that Donald Trump does have a great chance of winning the primaries. But many of his candidates, the Trump-endorsed candidates in the midterms, lost in the general election. I think that, with these MAGA Republicans, those moderate and swing voters that they depend on are not going to back them. They're going to back the Democrats. And I think it also mobilizes Democratic voters. We're seeing a lot more Democratic turnout because, we saw the horrendous 4 years that happened under Trump, and we don't want that again. So, if Trump does, win the primary, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the general elections. I hate making predictions, but if it tracks the midterms, that's what I think it will happen.
Do you think it's because I know a lot of people equivocate the progressive side of the Democratic Party to the MAGA side of the Republican Party, but then we're also seeing progressive success for the past, 8 years in Congress, and now we're kind of seeing a MAGA failure. So do you think it's more of a messaging failure for the MAGA side, or a policy failure, or maybe a mix of both? Where do you think it is that they're failing, and why do you think it is?
It's very interesting that you brought that up, actually, because Bernie Sanders. I'm going to go back to Bernie Sanders for just 1 second.
Always back to Bernie.
When he ran against Donald Trump, both times actually, he did draw from the bottom of that the Donald Trump base. The horseshoe effect, where as you get closer to both sides, the votes are similar. The voters are similar in ideology. And that did happen with Bernie Sanders, and I think it'd be really interesting to see. Here's one more prediction. I do think there's a high possibility that Bernie Sanders does run in the next election. So I think he's got a way better chance of winning in 2024 than he did in the past two elections, especially if Joe Biden decides not to run. But I think that it's a really interesting point. Can Bernie Sanders take some of that MAGA base that's not as conservative, socially conservative as some of the Trump supporters are, and I think it's possible. I think that he does have the opportunity to take some of that base and possibly win.
Yeah, I think, like you said, he actually did take a lot of that MAGA base in 2016 against Hillary, and then he's also received a lot of criticism for maybe not backing Hillary enough, and then he had a lot of people voting for Trump.
Totally.
What do you think about that kind of what happened there, and does that maybe make you think of Bernie Sanders a little less, or what do you think?
Yeah, so I think the thing about Bernie Sanders is the Democratic Party as a whole in the past has traditionally not loved him. He hasn't got as much support as those institutional Democrats, the Hillary Clintons, the Joe Bidens, those that have been, in politics for years. And Bernie Sanders, yes, has been in politics for years, but he's also kind of the outsider. He's not a Democrat at all, actually. He's an independent in Congress. So, he's not really participating in the Democratic Party on a national level as much as Hillary Clinton is. So I think it's unfortunate that he's getting less support. But I also think it was a poor choice on his end to not endorse Hillary Clinton during that election, because I think that could have contributed to many other factors, including the James Comey investigations. But I think that could have contributed to her loss.
And to that point a little bit, I know Josh and I, so a little more context. I am definitely left-leaning, and I would even say I would vote with progressives most often than not. And I do tend to shit on progressives a decent amount because of this kind of attitude. I feel like sometimes if it's not the perfect solution, then they will not vote for it, and then in my opinion, you'll be left with literally nothing, even though you could have voted for something that could have done at least a little bit of good. Is that something that you feel, especially in this campus, which I would say is more left-leaning than most?
Yeah, so let me start on the national level. I think that just recently, as I'm sure you're aware, when the Joe Manchin side deal was made public about him expediting different procedures and policies about oil and coal and different environmental procedures, progressives got really upset. In fact, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and others wrote a letter saying they would not fund the government if this was allowed to pass through. So I do think that they make these threats a lot. Will they act on them? I don't think so. Especially with how close the majority the majority is in the Senate. They need everybody. They need Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin has, caused many problems in the Democratic Party because he's got so much leverage. So I do think that they do, make these public stances once in a while, but I don't always believe that they always will act on them. Yeah. And plus Nancy Pelosi, she was a great whip. She whipped her party and her caucus, when she needed it. She always got the votes. So it'll be interesting to see now that she's gone, but not really gone. I think she's going to be, in the back a little bit. But AOC is going to go out there and say things, but in the end they needed her vote, and she's not going to tank a policy just because there's not this one progressive, point in there, or policy in there, because, then you're giving it to the Republicans, and that's not what they want.
I'm just going to push back a little bit just because
Sure.
I did write about this. I don't know how familiar you are with permitting reform. I think that's what you were referencing to, right?
Yep.
So that was, from my understanding, that was killed because they didn't have enough votes, because, of course, the Republicans aren't going to vote for them. Mm-hmm. But to be fair, I expected them not to vote for them.
Yeah.
And then the progressives, like you just mentioned, also didn't vote for it. So they did actually end up killing this thing, which is, in my opinion, and I think, of course, I would think almost subjectively, right?
Yeah.
that it was a good thing, since there are, I think, the amount of renewable energy that is stuck in permitting, which means, the government or the state is investigating how it'll work, and they're taking all this feedback in, and it takes years, is double the amount of energy we have now, right? So this goes a long way for something like climate change, which progressives champion, and yet it would also make some projects, it's 10% of projects stuck in permitting or coal and oil and that kind of stuff. They would happen faster, right? So the thing I am annoyed with at progressives often is this idea of their inability to do this kind of cost benefit, right? Mm-hmm. In this case, you get 90% of renewable energy versus 10% of bad energy, right? Coal and all these things. So that's the kind of thing that I think pushes me a little more to the right when I look at in the context of the Democratic Party. And I don't know do you think that is a normal thing to think? Because Josh gets on me a lot about this.
I mean, don't get me wrong. The squad in the House and the progressives in Congress, they have pull. I was not implying that in any way. But I agree with you. I think that they just don't have the support, the numbers, to fully back some of their policies and take these certain stances. However, that might be starting to change. This after the midterms, they've elected the most amount of progressives in Congress ever, including one from Vermont, the new representative-elect Becca Balint. So I mean, that could start to change. But I do agree with you. I think that a lot of people are pushed more towards the moderate Democratic senators, because the base of the Progressive Party in the Congress doesn't have the numbers to effectively whip all the other senators and representatives.
And then I wanted to circle back to something. So the Democratic Club here at Northeastern and the Republican Club had a debate about 2 weeks ago, and one of the things you guys talked about was nuclear energy at some point. And I was pleasantly surprised when the three people that spoke for the Democratic Club came out as pro-nuclear. And I wonder, because the divide is about 60% of Republicans support it versus 40% of Democrats or something like that. So Republicans normally support pro-nuclear more than Democrats. Why do you think that is? And since you're a pro-nuclear advocate to a certain extent, how do you think you can push that message more within your party and just at a national level as well?
Yeah, so I think this is definitely somewhere where I don't necessarily agree with the national political trend of the Democratic Party. I think that nuclear energy is an untapped resource that we have yet to fully explore. With that being said, I think that there's some stigma around nuclear energy around the globe. There's been different disasters in different countries that have made the thought of nuclear energy a little bit skeptical. And I think that's what Democrats mostly are thinking about like the human impact of having nuclear energy. With that being said, I think as we move forward and advance these technologies in advanced scientific research on nuclear energy, that this is a resource that could help generate clean energy for the United States and the globe as a whole.
Yeah, so you would maybe pin this on more of a messaging strategy issue, so people maybe aren't so comfortable with it.
Yeah, and I just don't think it's talked about a lot, right?
Yeah.
We're all in college in a pretty progressive, higher ranking university where we have these in-depth discussions, but a majority of people aren't. Majority of people don't know about nuclear energy or don't know about the benefits of it, and only think of nuclear meltdowns and radiation everywhere, right?
And we can be honest, nuclear it's boring. Energy policy is boring, right?
Exactly.
Do we give $10 billion to build this energy plant here or not? It's boring things, right? Let's talk about guns and abortion and more.
Or even space. That's
space,
more interesting than investing in a nuclear power plant. And I think that's also part of why environmental policy is hard to talk about in the United States, is because there's just this lack of motivation to talk about it in general. We just talked, as we just mentioned, abortion or, the inflation and the cost of gas and groceries, matter more to people than, if my car is electric or if there's a nuclear power plant, giving energy for my town. And that's no fault of their own. It's from a fundamental policy in top-down, approach. If you are not supporting your communities and your citizens and your constituents on basic social programs, something that Bernie Sanders and others talk about all the time, like giving them healthcare, giving them food, making sure they have a place to live, right? If they had all those things, then maybe it would be easier to talk about the climate crisis and nuclear energy and all these other topics, because you can't just do one without the other, right? They're all connected in one way or the other. So I think that on a national level, we need to start talking about move away from is climate change real and what can we do to combat climate change, which other countries, and especially in Europe, are doing now. But we're still trying to debate whether it even exists, which is a huge problem.
We need to make nuclear energy cool again, I think, is what you're saying.
Right. Great again. Nuclear energy great again.
I'd vote for that.
So just if you wanted to move on, Jack. So I think Jack also wanted to get into housing and zoning. So maybe do you want to ask a question about that? I know he's so interested in it. He can't wait to talk about it.
The reason is, again, because I was surprised, right? So this debate happened 2 weeks ago, and I don't know how familiar Josh is or our viewers might be with YIMBYs and NIMBYs, which I know are kind of political terms now, and so I see articles all the time that these might not be the right terms to use or whatever, but using these, so a YIMBY is yes in my backyard and a NIMBY is not in my backyard, and basically a YIMBY would say, and this is all pertains to housing, a YIMBY would stay, and interrupt me if I'm saying this wrong at any point, by the way, because you definitely know more than me. YIMBY would say that certain aspects of housing and zoning should be reformed or even ended to allow for things like multi-family homes in places where, for example, single-family homes exist, right? Because, again, housing is very expensive, so why not build up, right? That's kind of the whole messaging idea. A NIMBY, a not in my backyard, would say, let's not do that for multiple reasons. One, and some Republicans are NIMBYs and might say this, you might not want to kind of change the traditional landscape of your city. You don't want to build up when you have these beautiful 2-story townhomes. I am from Palo Alto, California, which is a left-leaning area that is pretty NIMBY, because they like the way it looks. They like the small city feel, even though these houses are, $3 million for a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom. And then some progressives, which this is beginning to change, have also come out as NIMBYs just because it can be seen as gentrification, or it can be seen as displacing some communities that should be there in the first place, right? So I wanted to get your take on this, just because, again, I was pleasantly surprised with you being a YIMBY.
Yeah, so a member of our e-board would definitely have a strong opinion about this, more than I do. But yeah, he argues all the time, like, building up is what we need to do. And to some extent, I do agree with him. However, as you mentioned, I'm also from Vermont with a multi-acre home, and I love my property, and that's a different lifestyle that I've had. I've never, I didn't live. I mean, I've traveled to Boston, but I never lived in Boston. Yeah. So that's what I'm used to, right? But talking about gentrification, especially here in where we're going to school, we're all temporary residents, right? And most of us here at Northeastern and Harvard and BU and BC, right? Expensive universities here, come from, wealthier families or higher economic statuses. And we're taking homes in Roxbury and Beacon Hill and pushing out people who can't afford them, right? Landlords and owners of homes can raise prices on apartments and houses because they know that we can and will pay for that instead of living in Northeastern housing, right? So it's a huge problem. We need to try to make sure that we're not displacing communities by us being here. And this is, not just for college students, it's on a national level. There is a housing crisis. So I think that, building up is the best way to combat this, but it's also on a more fundamental level, lowering cost of homes. Looking at Roxbury, homes are expensive and people can no longer afford those. People who have been there for generations and have lived there and grown up there and made families there. And then, I come in and others come in and we need to find an apartment because, we live here now. And we could pay double the price that they could pay, right? So I think that, on a fundamental level, we need to start talking about pricing and housing and how we need to ensure that, we're not disrupting whole cultures and societies and communities when we and others, move to these areas. And I think, building up is one way to do that. Northeastern is in the process of getting approval for a new, high-rise building complex over on Columbus. The problem is, that then raises property taxes in the Roxbury community. Yeah. So again, we're here at this situation where building a huge building, for a university, yes, it may increase the number of students coming back and living on campus, but what is the effect of this, the continued effect on the Roxbury community and other communities that are in the area? It's still going to be wicked expensive for families that are not making a lot to live there.
I agree, and I think we're starting to see a shift. I don't know if you have an opinion on this, not only because housing is very expensive, or at least it's starting to come down, but it's been talked about way more. But also because for some reason, I don't know where this kind of started, I hear this all the time, talking about things like infrastructure, roads, or getting rid of parking lots because they take up a lot of space, right? There's this war against parking lots, which I support. And all of these kind of zoning and city urbanism, all of these things, I don't know where it started. I love it. I think it should continue being a topic, but I do think the shift towards kind of looking at cities and how they structure and making them more, structure around people is kind of the term that's used, is beginning to shift. So I do think that will change in the future, hopefully.
I agree. I think it will too. I think especially transportation, as you brought up, I'll just talk about it for 1 second. I think that, there's this American thing about driving your car, right? The freedom to drive, the freedom to, go wherever you want. But as we know, that's leading to a lot of, greenhouse gases and, being put in the atmosphere by, driving personal cars. And I think we're going to start seeing a shift of, increasing public transportation. Countries around the world do it much better than, we do in Boston or even in the United States. I mean, obviously New York's a little different, but even them, they could still be doing a better job at increasing, public transportation, buses, trains, for people to get in and out of the city.
Yeah, and just as an anecdote for me, I was in the Netherlands recently, and I remember I was on the subway, and it shut off for maybe 2 minutes, and there was no light. And I looked around, and everyone was distraught. All the locals were raising their hands, asking to get a refund, and they were getting refunds, and they were like, "Can you please pay for my $60 taxi to get home? What's happening? This has never happened." They were launching complaints, And here I'm happy if the subway isn't catching fire over
right?
a river, right? So it's definitely something that has to change quickly.
Totally.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of moving on, I wanted to. This was also another kind of topic mentioned in the debate, is crime. And you were bringing up personal experiences there that you can kind of get into. But we're seeing that crime is becoming a huge issue for single issue voters, and especially in places like Georgia and Pennsylvania. It almost caused the downfall of John Fetterman in Pennsylvania. That was like the soft on crime, along with a host of other things too. But that almost like led to his downfall. So I was kind of wondering what your position is on crime policy, and do you buy that Democrats are soft on crime?
So the answer to that question first, no, I don't believe that.
Yeah.
Second, I think that if you look at the data on a national level, and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to also disagree with what I'm about to say. On a national level, crime has been decreasing for years, and I said that during the debate, and I'm saying it again here because it's really important to know. And I think that the war on crime and the war on drugs that's used by the Republican Party is used as a tactic to cause fear in communities and fear in voters for them to vote with like the strong pro-policing candidate, the Democrats. But that's just not the case. Crime has been decreasing overall, for years, and it's continued to fall. COVID kind of did screw some things up there, but in general, it's starting to fall. However, there's cities around the United States that are suffering from high levels of crime, and it's still a serious problem in different communities. And I think that the biggest problem is the amount of guns that are on the street, right? And I'll talk a little bit about my experience right now, too. I mean, I've worked with in law enforcement in different capacities over the past few years. I've worked with the Vermont State Attorney's Office. I worked with prosecutors and worked with, law enforcement professionals across the state. And I also, worked in the Rutland City Police Department, my hometown. So I actually, was out on scene doing traffic stops, finding dead bodies, actually. That kind of thing. And obviously it's different in Vermont because it's not like an urban place. But Vermont has had the most amount of homicides ever in decades. Guns are coming in from other places with low restrictions. And I think that's the biggest problem is, street crime and crimes with guns and mass shooting events are becoming way too frequent. Banks are being robbed in my hometown actually still. And I'm like, who commits bank robbery anymore? Like you never get away with that, right? But it's happening and people are getting illegal guns and oftentimes not illegal guns, which is the case of majority of time. They're getting guns legally in another state and crossing borders. Causing more an uptick in gang violence or in all these other things. So I think that, on a policy level for guns, and that's what I'm going to talk about the most, especially after the recent Supreme Court decision, the New York Rifle and Pistol Association case, which is totally restricting or limiting the amount of restrictions that states can impose on carry permits and gun regulations in their states. It's a huge problem, and it's what's causing this uptick in violence, I think. And we need this threshold, this baseline of policy on a federal level, so that all states are, have this baseline gun policy, so that this can't happen, that there's no more loopholes. Even in the background check system, it's possible for a person who's not allowed to have a handgun, have it for up to 3 days before the ATF or the FBI can even get there to retrieve that gun and back, which again is a huge problem. So, and I think this is a problem being perpetuated by conservatives in general. I think that there's this American thing about guns and owning guns, and there's a common misconception that Democrats want to take away guns because that's not what they want to do. And of course, there's always exceptions. Maybe there's that one or two, really progressive candidates that are like, let's not have guns at all. But on a general level, that's not what Democrats are advocating for. They're making sure that people who don't deserve or are qualified to have a gun, so they don't get it, right? Making sure that we don't give those people access to those weapons. And I think we need more of those restrictions and more of those processes and procedures that limit the amount of guns that are on the streets and in the hands of people who don't necessarily qualify to have them.
Yeah, I know I agree. And I think you see a lot of Republicans who say, well, the issue with crime, maybe isn't guns, it's lack of law enforcement and I think a lot of Republicans are willing to agree on, higher background checks and maybe a little tiny bit of gun restriction. But for the most part, they really want to, not have gun restriction. And they would maybe even make the argument that my right to complete free ownership of guns supersedes this issue. Kind of, what do you think? Do you think that law enforcement numbers are an issue? Do you think the gun, obviously, what would your response be to gun ownership rights? What do you think about that?
So about your policing question, again, I've worked in law enforcement, so I know that across the board that there's been a decrease in people wanting to become law enforcement officers. I think that there's a lot of pressure from the top and the bottom, right? There's communities that are upset with poor policing practices, rightfully so, because there's problems with the criminal justice system. And then there's also, the elected officials and the policymakers at the top that are also pushing down on police officers because either one, they don't have great policies in those states, or two, they want to, reduce the amount of police officers in these communities, which I don't think is, general across, the United States. But I think that, there's just there's a bigger problem about the criminal justice system that needs to be addressed before people start pursuing the criminal justice profession again. I now sit on the advisory board for the Northeastern Police Department, so I oversee police procedures and complaints and other things. And they are also looking for police officers, right? This is the lowest rung on the law enforcement scale, a college campus, and they're struggling to find law enforcement officers, right? So that tells you, the lack of interest in criminal justice. But I think that we need to start addressing the major issues first, the broken policies that are perpetuating racism, that are perpetuating violence, that are, literally getting people killed, and not holding police officers accountable. There's a huge discussion. I've had it in my classes here. I'm sure you guys know about it too. Is about the qualified immunity thing, and I think that this system needs to be improved. I'm not saying get rid of it because that's the one thing I'm also disagreeing with my party on is ending qualified immunity because not everybody thinks it's only for police officers, but it's all for all government officials. And I think that, we need to start fixing these policies. We need to make sure that we're holding bad cops accountable. And I think that if we do that, we'll start seeing an increase, in people wanting to pursue this profession. But I don't think that it's Democrats that are anti-policing or anti-cop. I think that's just, again, a stereotype, a misconception perpetuated by the Republican Party to try to gain as many votes as possible. Yeah.
And since one day you're going to be in Capitol Hill and you're going to be a senator and all of that, I want to get your take on this because I'm going to solve this issue for the Democrats right now, okay? I want to see more Democrats shooting guns and being I like guns, but some people, for example, and
Democrats shooting guns, okay?
Good, and they should, because I think it's a good messaging strategy for them as well, to show that, look, we're not taking your guns away, because this conception, I agree, super overblown by Fox and all these pundits, right? Of course, they don't want to take your guns, but it's overblown because, and maybe in Vermont this isn't the case, but in many cases you don't see Democrats, talking about guns or upholding, that they have a gun or that they don't want to take them away. So I think that they should say, if you're going back to the Republican talking point, if you're a good guy with a gun, you should have a gun. There should be restrictions for those who have maybe mental health issues or who are at higher risk of posing a threat, which, again, I was surprised when Republicans also during the debate agreed with this, or at least they said they agreed with it. So yeah,
I wouldn't hold your breath. Okay.
Yes. That is true. It is true. I read this recently that a lot of Republicans and the population as a whole, they say they want to vote for their background checks. When you tell them, do you want background checks? They say yes. And then when you say what a background check actually is, so a federal database and, that they would know that you have a gun, then the proportion of people who support it goes down drastically. But yes, I think it's interesting to get your insight as someone who has been, you have firsthand knowledge of what's going on kind of on the ground.
I saw Jack actually had this written up here. He has the Supreme Court, and he's talking about packing the Supreme Court. The nuclear option, he has it written. I'm kind of more interested in how aggressive you think, how much more aggressive Democrats can be in their policy.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court obviously is a hot topic, especially after the abortion case, right? A lot of people are consider the justices that are on the Supreme Court right now to just be politicians in robes, and I think that's a fair assessment. I think that during the Trump years, and actually before the Trump years, the denial of Merrick Garland's, nomination by Obama is where this all started. I think that the court has been politicized, and I think in something, there's headlines, of course, all over different media news networks. Justice Roberts is no longer in charge of the court, can no longer whip the conservative justices, is no longer able to unify that party in or that ideology. I'm not gonna say party, that ideology in the Supreme Court, and I think it's true. I think that we have elected we elected a president who nominated 3 judges or justices that are unqualified and, super pro-institution of the GOP rather than the rule of law. And they won't say that. But what can Democrats do to answer your question? I think that there's different reforms to the Supreme Court that we can talk about. I don't think packing the court necessarily is the right thing to do. And I say that because, if we start that trend, I fear that Republicans, when they, regain control, that they'll also continue to do that. So I actually have 2 proposals that I like to talk about a lot. And the first one is to establish term limits. And you're going to be like, you're crazy. You can't do that because the Constitution says you can't, right? And you are right to an extent. I think a way around that constitutional requirement that doesn't require the impossible, amendment, right? Is to allow justices to have senior status. So one of the things, one of the processes in the judicial system, except in the Supreme Court, is senior status for judges. So once they reach a certain age, they can go into senior status, and they only hear certain cases, or they're only called when there's an absence on the court, and they keep their same pay. They're still technically a judge. They just are not full-time, right?
Yeah.
And that, in my mind, meets all the requirements for the Supreme Court justice for life tenure, right? Yeah. They're still a judge. Yeah. They don't decrease their pay, right? Yeah. So there you go, right? Yeah. And I think that's the best way to do it. We need to limit the amount of time they can spend on the Supreme Court, and the amount, the oldness of the Supreme. Maybe not recently. We have some younger justices now, but in politics in general, there's politicians and judges, they tend to be older. So if we can establish this term limit, or at least, this term limit, then we can kind of rotate those judges in and out, so there's a more representative, panel of the American people. If the Democrats are in power, they can, they got elected. Democrats were elected, so they can have some, some Democratic justices, and I think that's the best way. The second thing I think a good reform would be is one that has been coined by and I did not make this up, has been coined by political scientists and law professionals, and it's the balanced bench theory, or idea, or policy, or however you want to call it. Yeah. And that, so that one is the president would still nominate justices. They would nominate 3. The Republican would nominate 3 Republican justices, and the Democrats would, elect 3 Democratic justices, right? Not elect, nominate. And then we're still missing 3 for the 9, right? The 3 or the 6 justices that have been, nominated and appointed would then together pick 3 more justices that they can all agree on, and then they would go and get, they would, recommend them to the president. Yeah. The president would then nominate them, and they would be approved by the Senate just like every other justice is. Yeah. And that way, there's 3 justices that are kind of in the middle. And I mean, even if this happens, even if the Democrats take 1 more and the Republicans take 1 more, and there's 4 and 4, there's that one justice that they both have to agree on. And if they can't agree on somebody, then they're not going to hear cases. And I think that is another approach that could decrease the polarization on the court and decrease, the amount of radical cases or radical decisions that they're coming out with.
Yeah, that's an interesting theory.
Yeah, I hadn't heard about that before. I'll have to research it.
You wanna
That's
say
all
after?
for me. I just wanted to say thank you. Josh is gonna lead us out with a
If you wanted to say anything else, do you want to shout anyone out, shout any clubs out, any initiatives? To
Any
the people?
initiatives? Come to College Dems. I think it's a great opportunity to get involved. And I think, on a general level for college students, go get involved with local elections, or go get involved with your state parties or your local parties. Whether you're a Democrat, Republican, Independent, a socialist, whatever, right? Just go out there, because it's really important that, as young people, we start to end this polarization and go and work together. So we can, kind of increase the efficiency and cooperation in Congress and between the American people.
Yeah, great. I agree. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. To all the listeners out there, make sure you go follow the Northeastern College Dems on Instagram, whatever else. Look them up on all the platforms. I'm not quite sure which ones you're on. Make sure you follow, subscribe, like everything for the J&J Politics podcast. And thank you so much. See ya.